Hello, everyone. I'm Hillary Sloan, and this is Driftwood Conversations, where we explore the stories, lives, and quiet revolutions of those living deeply connected to the natural world, to creativity, and something larger than themselves. Today I'm in conversation with Sant Khalsa, an artist, activist, and educator whose work explores the intersection of spiritual practice, environmental awareness, and artistic expression. Now living in Joshua Tree, her life, like the desert itself, holds the gems of transformation and distinct clarity, which she will share with you. Hello, Sant.
Oh, my goodness. Well, thank you, Hillary, for this opportunity to meet with you, to talk with you and our community. I am an artist, a curator, an educator, and an activist who has lived here full-time in Joshua Tree for about 7 years, but have had a residence here for about 15 years. And I've been coming out to Joshua Tree. First time I came here was 1973. So I have a long history with this place.
That's a romance.
It is a romance. That's why when I retired from teaching at Cal State San Bernardino, I wanted to move here, live here full time. Definitely a romance with this place and with Joshua Trees and with this community, which is always changing and growing. Came out here for the first time in 1973 on a road trip and have visited here, pretty much every year since I moved to Southern California, which was in 1975. And when I retired from Cal State San Bernardino, where I taught for over 30 years, I wanted to retire here.
So let's go back to the beginning then. You're a New Yorker.
Yes, I am.
Guilty as charged.
Yes.
Where did you grow up? And you've told me this personally before about how you grew to love trees. I would love to hear that story again.
So I was born and raised in New York City. I lived from the time I was 2.5 to the time that I left New York to go to college. I lived in an area of New York called Riverdale, which is just north of Manhattan in the Bronx along the Hudson River. It's a very green area of New York City. And so I grew up with a lot of trees. Even though I spent a lot of time in the city, I went to high school in Manhattan. It wasn't like I only saw concrete, glass, and steel. I was always drawn to Central Park. So I've always felt a real connection with green spaces and with trees. There was specifically a tree that was outside of my window of the apartment building that I grew up in New York. And I would watch the changes, watch that tree grow, watch the changes with the seasons, and I just always felt connected with trees.
Did your activism really begin when you got to California then?
No, my activism started in New York. I came of age in the 60s, where I was very aware of the civil rights movement, the war in Vietnam. I went to demonstrations probably starting at around age 14, 15. I always had a real concern about people and the planet and environment. I think it might have something to do with my upbringing, because my heritage is that I'm an Ashkenazi Jew, and my family, many of my ancestors lived and died during the Holocaust. So I think I was very aware of political issues. Ancestors that came from Romania, Austria, Germany, Hungary, also the Ukraine.
Ooh, that must hit hard now. Do you still have any relatives there?
Not that I am aware of.
What did your family give you? Did you have any spiritual training?
My family went to synagogue. Actually, my maternal grandparents were Orthodox Jews, but I never felt that anything was ever really pushed on me. And, I just went to synagogue mostly on the high holy days. But from a very young age, and I would say in my early teens, I became interested in Eastern philosophy. And I became interested in meditation and yoga, and I was doing a lot of reading. I had an interest in lots of different philosophies. I had an interest in, different belief systems. I've always been someone who likes to do deep research. I was very inquisitive as a child. I continue to be that way. I'm a problem solver, and I just really like to learn, about a lot of things that are outside of what I already know.
You changed your name.
Sure, yes. So my given name was Sheila Roth, and in 1973, I moved from the East Coast where I had finished my undergraduate BFA degree in art at the Maryland Institute College of Art and MICA, and moved to Arizona. My family left New York while I was in college, moved to Arizona, which was a shock. I thought I'd spend my life in New York, and I decided to go to graduate school at Arizona State University, and so moved to the Tempe, Phoenix area. During that time, I really got active in taking yoga and meditation classes, specifically Kundalini yoga. And right around that time, I also met my now ex-husband. I got involved in this spiritual community and was given a spiritual name. I mean, I asked for a spiritual name, and that spiritual name was Sant, which in Sanskrit means saint. And it's the root word in many languages, for the word, for the saint, right? In French and Italian, and, Santo. And it stuck, and I kept it. And then I think by 1977, I legally changed my name because I felt more like Sant than Sheila. And a funny little antidote story, when I legally changed my name, I called my parents, who I was always very close with. And I said, I'm just calling to let you know that I've legally changed my name. So from now on, you're going to call me Sant and not Sheila, because it's now legal. And my mother said, I like Sant better than Sheila. And I said, you mean you like the name Sant better than Sheila? She goes, no, I like the person. And I thought that was really great.
That's pretty interesting.
Because she could see my whole transformation that came with my spiritual practice. Previous to that, I was pretty wild. I mean, I did a lot of recreational drugs and all those things that came with the 60s. And when I got, really serious about my practice, my life became much more meditative and calm. And the last thing I would think about doing was drugs, or I didn't drink. I became a vegetarian, which I remain, to these days. I don't do any of those things. So I became very health conscious and very conscious of other people, and not focused as much on myself, but focused on the people around me and community, and eventually became a teacher myself, both a teacher of yoga and meditation and then a professor of art.
When did your own art start? Was it within that time?
I was always an artist. From the time I was a child, I would draw and paint and work with clay, and I took lessons. There was a ceramicist that had a studio in the basement of our apartment building. So I would, after school, go and do ceramics. And then in junior high school, which is now called middle school, I went every Saturday down to Greenwich Village, and I took painting and drawing classes with an artist in their studio. And then I went on to the LaGuardia High School of Music and Art. And then I went on to MICA, Maryland Institute College of Art.
Oh, okay.
And then went on to graduate school to study art. And I have a master's degree and an MFA, a Master of Fine Arts in art. I've always been an artist. Art has always played a role in the way I view the world, and always wanted to interpret what I'm seeing and what I'm experiencing in my life experiences and world experiences through art. First, it was painting and drawing. And, like I said, I worked in ceramics and sculpture, which I still do, installation. And then my primary medium eventually became photography, which, has linked to other practices as well in art. So I've had this very interesting life of a spiritual practice, an art practice, and being very political, and all of those things kind of coming together.
When I interviewed you for the radio station, you said something to me that was so profound, it hit me. It was, I think I asked you how art works with activism. Do you remember that? Was it something like art will show you what you can't see?
Yes, absolutely. Art makes visible the unseen. I mean, people think, especially of photography, as a representation of the real. I mean, it is an interpretation. It depends on who makes that photograph, what you see, what they choose to show you, how they choose to show it to you, and reinterpret the world for the viewer. I really believe that art has that capacity to make seen what we don't see.
How did your career develop?
It's definitely been an evolution. Like many artists, we don't necessarily have a clear path. Like I've worked with, thousands of art students over the years, and I always say there's not one path in art. There's infinite paths in art. So for me, I think I competed. I have to say, I'm a pretty competitive person. I accept that about myself. I mean, as a youngster, I was very involved in sports. I was very competitive. People say they don't always like to play games with me, board games or whatever, because I'm very competitive. And now I'll make it public. I've been a poker player for numerous years, and I am competitive. So at a very young age, I started competing in art. I would enter contests. And I think I won some fashion design contests when I was 11 years old or something. I'd have to really look back at that. I mean, I started doing that at a really young age. I started exhibiting my work when I was in college, which is pretty typical. Undergraduate students have access to galleries at school, and I showed my work there. I mean, I have no idea how many hundreds of exhibitions and published in numerous books. And my work is in major museum collections, including the LA County Museum of Art, the Getty, the National Gallery of Scotland. I mean, I could go on. So, but I've worked hard for that. I've been committed to my work and committed to making work that I feel is environmentally and socially relevant, bringing awareness through my work to the fact that we are part of the natural world, that we're not separate from it, and that our lives would be very different if we would feel that, understand that, accept that. So I'm very committed to that and doing that through my work. The process for me of making art is bringing my own awareness to what's happening in the world, especially photography. and I know you are a photographer as well, a wonderful photographer. For me, photography has long been a tool for seeing. I look through the camera and can see things that I just don't seem to see when I'm not looking through that camera.
It's remarkable how photography becomes that kind of inner lens.
It's a way, for me, I get into some meditative state when I'm photographing, a very intuitive space where I am able to notice things in a way, see things, make observations that I might otherwise miss. For me, there's a very strong relationship between making a photograph and meditating, because in both you're being still. In my case, the way I photograph, being still, aware, mindful in that moment, being present.
I love what you just shared about photography as a meditative act, seeing it as a way of being present.
So I've been photographing now, that's 54 years, something like that. So I began photographing in 1971 when I was a student at MICA. It was a requirement for being a painting major. I was photographing primarily people, or people in environments, or I was going to demonstrations, anti-war Vietnam War demonstrations, or to women's awareness groups, and I was photographing. I was doing a lot of photography of myself. I was in a place where I was trying to understand myself as a woman, my age, coming of age. I moved to Arizona in 1973, moved to Southern California in 1975, and was living in an ashram, a yoga ashram, and was very kind of looking at my interior landscape, and I was still photographing people. And then in 1980, there was one of the biggest fires at that time that happened in Southern California. I was living in San Bernardino. It's called the Panorama Fire. And all of a sudden, I became aware of the power of nature, because I was so focused on this sort of like delving into my spiritual self and relationships with people. And I thought there was so much power in that. And I was looking for something sort of inside myself. And all of a sudden, there's this enormous fire. And I went, now that's where the power is, in nature. And that just sort of changed my life. That's how I ended up becoming a landscape photographer. And that's how I started moving from a photographer who was working on environmental issues, and then bringing in other disciplines to my practice, doing installation work, doing sculpture, doing more performative work, all of those things, because I moved into this place of first awareness about the power of nature, and then wanting to be more active in describing what I was seeing in terms of the way that human beings were destroying the environment. So it was just this whole transition that I went through over many years.
Was it at that time you began to talk to scientists?
So my first experience working with scientists was a project in 1992. But I should mention this. I have a long history with science in that I come from a family of scientists. My father, his father, and his father were all chemists and became pharmacists. And my sister is a chemist. Her two children are chemists. My son is a theoretical physicist. there's a lot of science in my blood. But in 1992, I was invited to be in an exhibition at UC Riverside at the California Museum of Photography called Smog, a Matter of Life and Breath. Up until that point, this was 92, so through the 80s into the early 90s, most of my work was focusing on water issues in Southern California, water quality, water scarcity. I was also looking at kind of the changes that were going on in the landscape because of development in Southern California. This specific exhibition, the idea of it, it was curated by Kim Ableys, one of my favorite artists who lives in Southern California. And she invited a group of artists to collaborate with scientists at UC Riverside's Air Pollution Research Center and asked if I would be interested. And I said, sure. So I was paired up with Dr. Paul Miller, who was a scientist who was looking at the most smog-damaged trees in the United States, which were in Strawberry Peak up near Lake Arrowhead. And I went up there with him and looked at these pine trees to see how damaged they were. And he was explaining all the science to me about specifically ozone pollution. And I asked him, what was the one thing that I could do as an individual that would have the most positive impact on air quality in the inland region of Southern California, specifically San Bernardino Riverside area that has had some of the worst, I think, second worst air quality in the United States. And I thought he was going to say something like, ride a bike. And he said, plant trees. And I thought, well, I can do that. So I called tree people in Pasadena and I told them that I was interested in planting trees. And they asked me where I lived, and I said, San Bernardino. I was a professor in the art department at Cal State San Bernardino. They said, there's a big project going on up in the San Bernardino Mountains up near Big Bear, Holcomb Valley, where the gold rush was in 1860 in Southern California. The area was destroyed by gold mining and clear cutting to build Southern California and raising cattle. And they're reforesting Holcomb Valley. Talk to them. So I contacted them and said, I want to plant trees. So I went up there every weekend through the spring of 92. I brought my students and we planted thousands of trees. And now there's just this beautiful forest in Holcomb Valley of 30 to 40 foot high ponderosa pine trees. And that experience of planting trees was so transformative for me. And it changed my work. That was when I really started focusing on doing work that was more interactive with the audience, because I wanted them to have an experience where they understood that we have a symbiotic relationship with trees through the breath. And because I had done so much breathing work since I was a teenager in yoga and meditation, I thought, oh my goodness, breath. This is the way to connect it all. So I started doing meditation altars about trees and Tibetan prayer wheels and prayer books and all these different things that sort of brought together our relationship with trees through the breath, because they provide oxygen and we give them carbon dioxide, and we are connected through that. And that led me to rethink my work about water as well. And I started doing all this new work about water, installation work and performative work where people were drinking water as part of the art, what I call consuming the art, because they were actually drinking water as part of it. So that the whole idea was that I wanted people to think of their bodies as a river and realize that we're drinking water, and then the water goes through our body, helps to nourish our bodies. Then the water leaves our bodies, goes back into the aquifers, is purified, and then we drink the water again. So again, we're connected with the natural world through water. So that sort of became the foundation of my practice. I know you started with the scientists, but that sort of became fundamental to my practice. The natural elements are how we are connected, and we are part of the natural world.
No, this is perfect. This is exactly what Driftwood Conversations is about. This is where we'll end today. This conversation with Sant Khalsa has taken us through decades of artistry, activism, and spiritual insight. In part 2, we'll dive into her most recent projects, including her latest exhibition, and talk more about her life here in the desert and the community she continues to nourish. If you're enjoying Driftwood Conversations, I invite you to explore earlier episodes. You'll find equally powerful stories from artists, activists, and ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Please consider subscribing, sharing the podcast with friends, and leaving a review. It truly helps these conversations reach more people. Until next time, thank you for listening.